Hello and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, to L24 News special coverage of the Ukraine fight. With Russia's special military operation in Ukraine now approaching its fifth week of fighting, President Vladimir Putin's forces have exerted brutal forces and destruction on the Eastern European nation, forcing people to flee out and making millions homeless. Russia's economy is now cracking under the immense weight of international sanctions and the cost of war, having largely failed to achieve major military victories in Ukraine, as the West claimed. On the other side, Moscow and Putin says that everything is going as we planned and we will reach the aim and the main goal while we launch this operation. To this end, multiple questions comes to the scene. After 33 days of fighting overnight, why Putin is still thinking he is winning, and how this conflict can change European lives, and how this operation will come to an end. Our panel of guests, represented by Mr. Claudio Klein, editor of Strategic Alert Service in Germany, Kirill Molchanov, PhD in Political Science from Ukraine, and Benjamin Barton, Assistant Professor in Nottingham University from Malaysia, will give us an answer to our questions. Gentlemen, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. The discussion begins right after this break. And before we go down to this debate, latest updates of Russian military operation in Ukraine in its 33rd day. Moscow has dismissed the possibility of talks between Russia and President Vladimir Putin and his Ukrainian counterpart Volodymyr Zelensky for the time being. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said that Biden's command was alarming, continuing war of words between Russia and the US that has stepped up in the recent weeks. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has called on the US and Europe to supply more planes, tanks and anti-missiles defenses and anti-ships weaponry, arguing that Europe's own security was at stake. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Kyiv negotiators are thoroughly studying Russia's demand for a Ukrainian neutrality, one of the central points of negotiations with Russia to end this conflict.
Security guarantees and the neutral, non-nuclear status of our state. We are ready to accept this. This is the most important point. This point of the negotiations is understandable to me, and it is being discussed. It is being carefully studied.
Mr. Kirill, since you are now in Ukraine, I will be starting with you. What is happening exactly in the ground over there, and how can you explain Zelensky's statement?
If we see the situation of last days, we have a very hard military situation because the war is nowadays it's like a position war. So there are no massive attacks from Russian troops, but they have many bombs or rockets every day moves to Ukrainian like petroleum station, like gas station. So they have their military forces been to our maybe infrastructure, social state. So now nowadays we need to have a stable truce to have the opportunities for our citizens to move from the regions they have been in war, like in eastern Ukraine and like in the south part of our country. So maybe without our European and American partners, we don't have opportunities to have to have some starters to move the situations that we have with our citizens, like maybe in towns like Mariupol, because there's a humanitarian catastrophe. So maybe Nowadays, it will be a very hard situation to live in this part of our country.
Understood. Mr. Claudio, how can you read the statement of the Ukrainian president to end the conflict, saying that we are looking forward for neutrality as the Russian demands? Is that a direct answer that he is no longer thinking of the Western allies to stand with his country?
Yes and no. So I think this is good news, but I ask myself whether we can believe to what Zelensky says in terms of whether Zelensky is really in command in Kyiv or whether other people, other forces are in command and he's just acting as a puppet. Unfortunately, his behavior in the last weeks and the last months lead me to opt for the second option. But let's stick to what he said. He said he's ready to negotiate Ukraine neutrality. By what I mean, he said just 1 day ago or 2 days ago that they are dropping their request to join NATO, but they want, nevertheless, to enter the EU. And the people in Brussels have rejoiced at this statement. Now, if you look at the EU treaties, then you realize that entering the EU, joining the EU, will bring you automatically inside NATO, if not formally, but substantially, because the EU treaties say that the EU countries are allied with NATO and work with NATO. On the other side, I don't understand why a country which insists so much on sovereignty wants to give up its sovereignty and join Europe, because if you join Europe, you lose your sovereignty. I mean, I can tell you as a citizen of the EU, I'm an Italian citizen working in Germany, so I live between Italy and Germany. I can guarantee you there is no national sovereignty once you join the EU. But yes, yes, if Ukraine accepts neutrality, this is good news. Now, let's put this in context, because this war has never been a Ukrainian issue. This war has been a NATO versus Russia issue. Or better said, the Anglo-American world, the Anglo-American system against Russia and China. That's what it is. So unless this is addressed in its totality, and that's what the Russians wanted from the first moment, there won't be a solution for Ukraine, because Ukraine's future, I mean, if I were a Ukraine citizen and a patriot, I wouldn't like to be either in one of either two blocks which would be built on the European soil. I would like to be integrated in Eurasian as one area of economic cooperation and political stability.
Quite understood. Mr. Benjamin, in your point of view, is Ukraine reached the end point and now they are looking forward to have stability and diplomacy talk with Russia? Taking into consideration what our guest Claudio has just said, is that now it is the last time for Ukraine to solve its sovereignty.
Well, I kind of do agree with the previous speaker to a certain extent, in the sense that I think that, Zelensky may be bluffing to a certain extent with regards to entertaining talks with the Russians. Because, of course, Ukrainian resistance is not going to end, even if there are talks ongoing, even if there are negotiations. Now, negotiations, indeed, are still important because there needs to be some way out of this conflict, not only just for the Ukraine, but also for Russia, because Putin will not leave this conflict without having a clear exit door. So maybe talks is one way for both sides to, in a way, compromise towards, bringing the conflict to an end. But are they going to reach an agreement? What are going to be the terms? We've also heard about the possibility of the Ukraine being split in two. I just can't see how Zelensky would agree to that, because, again, if we're talking about sovereignty, that would be, a huge compromise on Ukrainian sovereignty. So I don't think that's really in question. In terms of the prospect of, joining NATO being removed, that could work, I guess, in the short term as a way of appeasing Putin. He could then sell that as a victory in his conflict, because that's ultimately what the Russians are going to need. They're going to need something. The leadership is going to need a victory from this to show the people of Russia and the rest of the world, and even the detractors, that they have found a way out of this conflict and they've gained something from it. But does that solve the issue? No, it doesn't, because as the previous speaker mentioned, there's always membership to the European Union, and if membership to NATO is off the cards now, it doesn't mean to say that further down the line it won't be reignited as an issue again.
Quite understood. Coming back to you, Mr. Carroll, now the common ground and the common point between all the parties is that negotiation is the only solution. But the question is why it didn't work before this negotiation, why diplomacy failed?
The hard situation with negotiations is because that both countries, Ukraine and Russia, think that their time is working or in their favor. So, like Ukraine thinks that if we have long negotiations, the Russian economic will be failed. Yes, the sanction from European and American countries will be destroyed. The currency of Russian. So President Zelensky don't want to go to some compromises maybe at all. And the Russian thinks another. They think that the military forces advance their army. So maybe sometimes they have opportunity to have some progress in eastern Ukraine. And it will be the issue to Ukraine to go to some negative compromise for our country. So I think that in this situation, also the second part that we have a very opposite position to this negotiation. Yes, Ukraine delegation wants to have only...
Mr. Kiro, I'm sorry to cut your train of thought, but as a direct question, do you think diplomacy will give us a solution? Yes, no?
Diplomacy give us a solution, but it's not will be not tomorrow in Istanbul, where will be this negotiation, and maybe not in about a few weeks.
Okay, quite understood. Now moving on to the second point. A day after President Joe Biden said his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, should not be allowed to remain in power, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has denied that the United States has any plans to bring about regime change in Russia or anywhere else. Joe Biden also described Vladimir Putin as a butcher. Remarks made the French President Emmanuel Macron warn they could be provocative and further escalate tensions. Coming back to you, Mr. Claudio, is it wise to call your enemy that kind of, he is still looking to find solution by the word butcher? Don't you think that this is another step that will push the escalation forward?
Yes, I think this is pushing the escalation forward. And, there is I think there is a calculated strategy behind this. They might push President Biden to play the poor guy, giving his age and a little bit dementia, and then they deny what he said, but de facto they have escalated the situation. And there is a strategy behind this. I mean, the United States policy is run by a close group which has been formed in the State Department. It's called the Tiger Team. And it's a situation similar to the one preceding the war against Iraq. This team is elaborating strategies has elaborated strategy in order to create conditions for pushing Russia into war in Ukraine. And they are still elaborating policies on the basis of an information war, bypassing American intelligence agencies. So, for example, the information that Russia would be now ready to use chemical weapons in Ukraine comes from this team. And this has been denied by the Pentagon. People in the Pentagon have told Newsweek that they don't see any sign of this, and so on and so forth. So as I said before, we have to put this into context. The context is the Anglo-American world, and I say this precisely because I want to include Britain into this. Britain plays a very important role. The Anglo-American world wants to stop Russia and China from rising in a position of major economic and political power in the world. And they want to do this exactly with regime change. So whoever denies this in the United States, they lie. Why would they then issue so brutal and massive sanction against Russia? Why then are they saying we want to destroy Russia? There was a French minister who said this explicitly. And now they push people to say that they want to call for assassinating President Putin. So of course they want a regime change, because if there is a regime change in Russia, then they can go back to the pre-Putin era,
perfectly
where Russia
understood.
was open to looting from Western financial and corporate interests.
Perfectly understood. Mr. Benjamin, if your country's president was called like that, how would you accept this? And why USA always keep thinking it has the right to say and to do whatever they want?
Well, I guess it depends in which context the information is being, propagated. I mean, obviously, if I was a patriot and I would be upset, I would imagine, depending on my views of the president, naturally. I mean, imagine that that information has been used by the Russian media and propagated by the state news agencies in a way to confirm the idea in Russia that the West is after Putin. And that's been one of the axes which the government has used to justify this conflict as well. So in a way, yes, that might hurt Putin personally, but it's the inflammatory tone actually does help him in a sense, because it justifies this ongoing conflict with this other world, this other civilization, the West, which has different values, different principles to those, which emanate in the Russian state. I think it's not all bad for Putin in a sense that he can leverage that.
Coming to another point, Ukraine's military intelligence chief Kirill Boldanov said that Russian President Vladimir Putin may look to split Ukraine into two countries, like North and South Korea. Boldanov added that there is a reason to believe that Putin is thinking of Korean scenario for Ukraine. That is, Russian forces will try to impose a dividing line between the occupied and non-occupied areas of this country. Mr. Kirill, as a Ukrainian, do you think this is possible to split Ukraine, and will that be beneficial for the ongoing fight right now?
I don't think that the Budanov is right in this situation, because the Russian Federation don't have nowadays any opportunities to contain the Ukraine or part of Ukraine, like the North Korea was financed many years by USSR and by China. So I think it's not the main scenario for this war. And if we see the requirements of Russian Federation to Ukraine on this negotiation, they want not only, like says my college in this essay, like non-nuclear status or neutral status, or don't move to NATO. So they also want things like to eastern part of Ukraine for Donetsk and Lugansk region for independence of these territories, and this is This will not be supplies with the Ukrainian citizens or by President Zelensky. So I think that the difficulties of this situation will be issues only maybe on the war and what of countries Ukraine or Russia have some
Kirill, I'm sorry to cut your flow of ideas, but South Korea and North Korea, that division was really successful. Now they are two countries and they are both independent. Don't you think that Ukraine deserves now to have this solution?
You know, by our powers or our governments don't have refuse of any part of Ukraine territory. So we cannot say that maybe this situation will be frozen at 20 or 40 years and the territory of Crimean Peninsula or the eastern part of Ukraine will be like a North Korea for a long, long time. So Zelensky says that he don't want that the conflict will be like maybe or northern or southern Cyprus or like you say or North or Southern Korea. So I don't think it will be really in 21st century.
Mr. Claudio, in Germany it happened before, the division of one country in two parts. So how this could bring a solution and an end to this military operation in Ukraine? And is it really possible to split Ukraine now after all these casualties?
Well, everything possible, but the question is who wants this and how long will it last? Is it stable? I mean, the history of Germany shows that this doesn't work because at the end Germany was unified, one people, one language, one culture. And I think I want to tell our Ukrainian, young Ukrainian friend who carries the name of a famous saint, Kirill, who Christianized Eastern Europe, that, I think personally that Russia could very well consider to go back to the status of Eastern Ukraine, which was discussed and agreed upon in the Minsk agreements. That status would see Eastern Ukraine, the Donbass, as part of one state, of one nation, but with a very large autonomy. A little bit like we have in Italy for regions like South Tyrol, which in Italy we call Alto Adige, where we have a large population of German language. And they have a special autonomy. This region is as much a larger autonomy than the other Italian regions. Another example is Sicily. Sicily was given autonomy to defuse the separatist threat after the end of World War II. And in both examples, and I could give you a third example at the border with France, with a French-speaking small region called Val d'Aosta, to defuse the threat of separatism, which was induced by foreign powers. I mean, in northern Italy, we had Austria on the German language population. In Sicily, we had Great Britain, who has nothing to do with Sicily. They have not Italian language, they have nothing, but they had geopolitical ambitions. So this thing has worked because the nation, the institutions have worked with this for many years now. So I personally think that if if the United States comes to terms with Russia on a real dialogue for security, for an inclusive, broad, at least European, but better international new security architecture where the interests of everybody, of every country is secured. I think the Russians could agree, and they would have even the means to put pressure on the eastern part of Ukraine to go towards this kind of settlement, which would keep the nation of Ukraine as an integrated nation. I mean, if you look, let me just conclude by saying, if you look and read at Vladimir Putin's speeches, there's one long speech he gave 1 year ago when he spoke about, in which he spoke about a larger community of Russian culture in Europe, and he included Belarus and Ukraine and Russia into this. He never speaks about one nation. He speaks about one community and different nations. So I think if we if the general problem, the larger problem, and I insist on this, is resolved of a general architecture of security where Russia is not threatened, then I would personally believe that Russia would be able to go this way.
Mr. Kirill, Mr. Claudio has just addressed you. What do you think about that? Saying that President Vladimir Zelensky a year ago said that we Ukrainians and Russia, we are one community, not two countries. What are you saying about this?
I think it was a good idea, yes, to have Minsk agreements like a roadmap to close the conflict from 2014 years, but in now situation, it seems like that the Russian wants to expand the Minsk agreements to the territories they have nowadays controlled by their military forces. So after months of this war, I think that the Putin wants more compromise from Ukrainian government about the future of these territories that they have now controlled. So I think if we have negotiations like Minsk agreements, maybe we can tell for all world that it will name like a Minsk not 2 agreements but Minsk 3. So it will be a new request from Russia and maybe new territory opportunities.
Quite understood. Mr. Benjamin, what are you saying about this plan of division? And do you think that Russia, as our guest said, Kirill, they are looking for an occupation?
I think this idea of, obviously that seems to be what Putin, one of the demands that Putin has is to have this buffer zone, but what are the outer limits of this buffer zone? Will it change over time? Those things don't seem to be very clear, which is why it's difficult at the same time for the Ukrainians and the rest of the world to truly believe exactly, what he's pushing for. And this idea of the occupation, that's, I agree. I think with Mr. Kirill, who's saying that, in a sense, this isn't a negotiation. This is not a friendly request. This is being enforced effectively as an expansion. So it seems difficult to believe. And just to come back to the point about the buffer zone and other prospective models, if we could learn from them and whether they could tell us about a possible pathway towards peace. If you take the Korean example, that's not going to work. Simply because, first of all, who beyond Russia is going to recognize this new buffer zone state? No one. And therefore, it's going to be in limbo. Whereas in the case of the DPRK, it has recognition from the international community. And we've seen this with Abkhazia, we've seen this with, the Donbass area, Donetsk, Lugansk, and so on, that these self-proclaimed independence moves are never recognized by the international community. So how is that going to solve the problem? It's not. It's only going to let the problem linger and fester, and then, later down the line, it might re-emerge, either on the Russian side or on the Ukrainian side, of, disputes over territory. So this is definitely not the way out of this crisis.
Quite understood. Moving on now to the Philippines and the United States have begun the largest ever combined military training in the island nation, signaling a strengthening of defense relations as a new tension in the dispute South China Sea emerged. The war games are the final ones under the outgoing President Rodrigo Duterte, who vowed to cancel them and sever ties with long-standing ally, the United States, as he shifted his focus to China. Mr. Benjamin, coming back to you. Last week, Russian ambassador in Philippines promised to create an energy nuclear power partnership with the country in Philippines. And now USA, Russia's rival, is launching a combined military training with Philippines. Both sides are trying to take Philippines to their side. Why? What is special about Philippines?
I'm not sure whether this is really about winning hearts and minds in the Philippines. Indeed, we can easily make a connection to what's going on in the Ukraine with many situations around the world. And you can see that, There's been mention about the Taiwan Straits, for instance. Is this a direct example, a copy-pasted example, which is going to be applied there? The US and the Philippines have had hot and cold relationships under Duterte's leadership, but he's coming to the end of that. There's elections in May. So this is simply, I think, the United States' way of, trying to rekindle that relationship because, the Philippines has something akin to a treaty alliance with the United States. That's under renegotiation right now. So perhaps that's also part and parcel of that renegotiation. Of course, the United States in the Indo-Pacific is eyeing Russia, but it's really more eyeing China and the maintenance of its primacy, of which good relations with the Philippines is at the core. I can imagine that the Russians are trying as best as possible to look for cracks in United States relations with many countries across the world, to test the waters, to see who's on their side. But I think that here, even a leader like Duterte himself, I doubt would be willing to go out, and express support for Russia at this time, given the circumstances. So I think that military operation, that training exercise, is rather more within the realm of US-Philippines relations in the context of the Indo-Pacific. And I'll just finish by saying that, at this moment in time, Russia is also having a relatively large-scale naval exercise in the north of the Indo-Pacific, off the Japanese coast, where it has a dispute with Japan. So it seems that, Russia really is at this moment in time trying its very best to ruin its reputation in different parts of the world, and it seems to be succeeding at doing that.
Perfectly understood. Mr. Keller, what is your expectation from Ukraine's allies so far after more than a month now? What they are waiting to save Ukraine? Do you think that Zelensky's will to join NATO was the black spot that pushed Russia to start this military operation in your country?
I think that the situation with NATO, it's maybe only one of the part of requirements of Russia to Ukraine, and they want maybe biggest opportunities for Kremlin in our country. They want very autonomic status for eastern part of Ukraine. They want that Ukraine official says that the Crimean Peninsula it's Russian territory. They want also demilitarization of our country. So I think it's the situation with NATO is only one of these cases, because we hear Biden speech in Warsaw, and he says that NATO don't want to have Ukraine like a partner in this organization, maybe at years, maybe in many years in the future. So I think the very hard situation nowadays from months of war that I don't know any political issues for Russian. They need to move one step back. They think that territories that have their military forces on ground nowadays, it will be maybe in future or like a part of Russian, or they think that they will be some autonomic status like the part of eastern Ukraine from 14 years. So I think we don't have a good issue nowadays. So in Ukraine there's
Understood.
The opportunity to have maybe some military result for our military forces, and after if we have some positive results by our troops, then we have a much more better situation in the negotiation with Russia in the future.
Mr. Claudio, Germany in one side is really in need for Russian gas and energy in general. And on the other side, the German officials are trying their best to stop Russian cooperation. Isn't that sort of contradiction? And how can you explain German soldiers' participation in Slovakia troops landing last week?
Yeah, I think You are right. It is a contradiction, and it's unexplainable from a rational standpoint, unless you come to the conclusion that Germany is being played into sacrificing itself in the same way as the Anglo-Americans have played Ukraine. The Anglo-Americans have eluded Ukraine, and they have played Ukraine against Russia and sacrificed Ukraine for their games. And they are doing the same thing with Germany. We are at a higher level, however, because according to classical British geopolitics, the British Empire should do everything to prevent collaboration between Russia and Germany. So if Germany and Russia collaborate, you will have a tremendous economic power growing on the Eurasian continent, on the Eurasian land bridge. And geopolitics, British geopolitics, which has been adopted by the United States, says you have to prevent this at all costs. And they actually have achieved it. They have achieved it that we have now a situation where a new iron curtain, an economic iron curtain, has been built, has come down between Germany, Europe as a whole, and Russia. This German government is particularly interesting from a clinical standpoint, because we have a coalition of ideology-driven forces, including the Green Party, which is a major partner, and the Social Democracy, who have joined the ideological blueprint of the European Union for decarbonization. So by implementing this policy way before the Ukraine crisis, Europe and Germany were on their way to self-destruction, economical self-destruction. And we have an energy crisis today, and although they blame it on Russia, they blame it on the war, this is self-inflicted. It started 1 year ago, and it started because of this ideological so-called decarbonization policy. So Germany is in a situation where they are under blackmail of NATO. You can say this. They have to do what NATO says because they fear the Americans and the British. But they need Russian gas. So there is no solution out of this. We will need Russian gas.
Thank you so much.
We will need it next year too if we don't want a blackout in this country.
Thank you so much. 3 minutes left for us. I have just been told by my technical staff. So I have one question. I need you to answer me briefly, you three gentlemen. Mr. Benjamin, starting from you. Do you think that Ukraine has been sacrificed for an already agent that has been made before?
Sorry, for a what?
Do you think that Ukraine has been sacrificed for an agent that has been already done?
No, I wouldn't go so far as to say that. I mean, I think this is a war at the very heart between Russia and Ukraine. I think this talk about a conflict between the West, Russia and China is talk, to be honest. There's no evidence to back that up. Of course, the West is opposing the conflict in Russia and is trying to put the noose around Putin's neck. Whether it achieves that or not is debatable. But at the very core, this is more an issue about Russia's identity, its relationship with the West, its relationship with the Ukraine and separatist regions in the Ukraine.
Understood.
And that's the starting point.
Understood. Thank you so much. Mr. Kirill, you, as a Ukrainian, do you think that you have been sacrificed for an already agent that has been made and plans? Because based on the statistics, everything was prepared before happening this military operation.
Yes, I think that in our situation we have that maybe our political establishment and our governments, they don't think that the Russia have already go to a full invasion in Ukraine territory. So I think maybe it's our, if we think about this last year, maybe nowadays we don't have so much territorial problems, and the negotiation last year will be more effective than they have now in this in the meeting in Istanbul tomorrow. Yeah.
Okay, perfectly understood. Mr. Claudio, ending up with your point of view and with your understanding, it is said that the list of sanctions has been already made up. This is why I have asked this question that Ukraine has been sacrificed for. What are you saying about this in a couple words?
Yes, I can repeat what I said before. It has been sacrificed for an agenda which had already been written. And talking to the sanctions, they think they can destroy Russia with sanctions, but Russia had prepared itself for sanctions. And indeed, sanctions are now hurting more us, more the West, than anybody else. And the West is already in a very precarious situation because we are on a financial system which can explode from one day to the next. And what the sanctions have done in the disruption of trade, the disruption of financial stability, this is deadly for us. And it's a race against time. And I think it's first the Western system that collapses.
Thank you.
Will collapse before Russia.
Thank you so much, Mr. Claudio, Mr. Kirill, and Mr. Benjamin. Thank you so much for joining us in this debate. I really do appreciate your presence. To this end, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us. A special coverage will be held also tomorrow. To this end, have a blessed evening.